Hi there, my name is Philip Eidson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact.
In today's episode, we're continuing our presidential elections special series by focusing on the policies and positions of Democratic presidential candidate Vice President Kamala Harris. Harris is 59 years old, a former senator from the state of California, former Attorney General of California. She became the presumptive Democratic nominee on July 21st, 2024, when President Joe Biden suspended his campaign for re-election. She then became the official nominee on August 22nd, when she accepted the nomination at the Democratic National Convention. Now, as a reminder, before we get into today's updates, here is where the following information is pulled from, and all of these resources are linked in today's show notes. I'm focused on primary sources. So the Harris campaign website, her policy platform, statements made in the debate, as well as publicly available speeches and interviews. Now, two other things before we dig into the policies. One is that, according to the site Ballotopedia, Kamala Harris added the issues page to her campaign website on September 8th, 2024. So I've been checking back, I've been pulling information. The information I will reference today is the most recent available. And the other note, there are actually two platforms that I had to pull from. Kamala Harris has her own, available through her website, called the New Way Forward campaign. But the Democratic National Committee also has a policy platform. It's difficult for me to tell which one would take precedence or how much, if any, involvement Kamala Harris and Tim Walz had in developing the party platform. So I will be clear to note which source of information I'm pulling from in each of these cases. Let's start with supply chain policy. So pulling from Kamala Harris's campaign website, there is definitely an emphasis placed on domestic manufacturing. Now, some specific pieces of legislation mentioned: the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, CHIPS and Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and the American Rescue Plan. The focus is truly on preserving jobs and making sure that materials and products are available. So I mentioned semiconductors, but auto manufacturing and EV jobs in particular are both mentioned. When we look at the information in the New Way Forward campaign platform in terms of what would apply to supply chain policy, there's definitely an emphasis on specific industries versus the transportation that we always think of as being part of the supply chain. So, for instance, there's a particular focus on supply chains related to food production, processing, and distribution. The campaign platform expresses concern about the level of concentration among food-related suppliers and the leverage that might give them over consumers. There's a proposed program that would expand production among new suppliers, specifically among small farms, growers, and processors, that would allow for some diversification. The idea is that through smaller producers, you would get more diversity, but at the same time, there would need to be an offset to address the fact that with smaller producers, you tend to get higher prices. Kamala Harris also talks about some of what they describe as the critical industries of the future. These include steel and iron production, biotechnology, data centers, especially as relates to AI, semiconductors, as well as aerospace, automobiles, and other forms of transportation. Now, one interesting piece that's not included in that platform is a mention of the White House Council on Supply Chain Resilience. So there's no way to know if that would be kept from the Biden administration to a possible Harris one. Also of interest, although the majority of the president's cabinet was made part of that White House council, the vice president is not a member based on the original executive order, and according to reports from the White House, was not at the inaugural meeting held in 2023. From supply chains, let's broaden to trade and tariffs. Now, I promised in part one that if there were an area of a candidate's platform where the information was scarce, I would call it out. I can already tell you in advance I'll be doing this in part 3 with regard to Donald Trump. I do it right now with regard to Kamala Harris. Tariffs are not mentioned on her official website, and in the policy platform, that New Way Forward document, the word tariff is only mentioned in reference to planned or promised actions on the part of Donald Trump. She did not mention tariffs in her DNC acceptance speech. And when asked to respond to Donald Trump's comments on tariffs in the debate, she did respond, but did not offer up what her own policy on tariffs would be. Now, this is another one of those places where, as I acknowledged, we can then look at the Democratic National Committee platform, which is separate from Kamala Harris's platform. It reads, quote, President Biden has taken decisive action to counter unfair economic practices by the PRC and level the playing field for American workers, strategically increasing tariffs on a variety of products such as steel and aluminum, semiconductors, electric vehicles, batteries, critical minerals, solar cells, ship-to-shore cranes, and medical products. So whether we can infer that same point of view and accompanying actions would carry forward from a Biden administration to a Harris one, that leaves some amount of question. Now, I referenced PRC in that last quote, and so that brings us to China. When I draw information from Kamala Harris's official campaign website, there were 2 quotes that stood out as being directly relevant. The first one, quote, Vice President Harris will not tolerate unfair trade practices from China or any competitor that undermines American workers. To me, that ties very closely to the quote I just read from the Democratic National Committee's own platform. The second one is, quote, she has met with China's Xi Jinping, making clear she will always stand up for American interests in the face of China's threats, and traveled to the Indo-Pacific 4 times to advance our economic and security partnerships. Now, when I look for references to China within the New Way Forward platform, there are 2 areas that jump out as being of importance. One is focused on the race worldwide to dominate artificial intelligence. And the second is focused around labor rights, presumably the motivations for tariffs, as well as efforts to safeguard intellectual property for companies that do business in China. Now, with regard to AI, the quote reads, they are proposing a historic investment to shore up our national and economic security by making sure the United States, not China, leads in AI by the scaling up and making permanent the National Artificial Intelligence Research Resource, a shared research infrastructure to give startups and researchers access to the most advanced computing power, data, and analytical tools to surge responsible discovery and innovation in AI. So clearly there's an understanding that not only is achieving dominance and worldwide authority around AI going to be critical for national security, it's also going to require investment on the part of the federal government. The second quote goes back to that point about labor rights and tariffs and intellectual property. Quote, the Biden-Harris administration has stood up to China when it breaks the rules, including when China has threatened American workers and businesses by engaging in unfair trade practices, such as flooding the global marketplace with artificially low-priced goods or engaging in forced technology transfers or intellectual property theft. Now, both of these points and the quotes that support them signify an understanding of how important it is to have a policy on China. When Kamala Harris was interviewed on 60 Minutes by Bill Whitaker, she was asked directly about her policy on and plans to deal with China. In her response, she indicated that she believes in maintaining the current One China policy, but also in allowing Taiwan to defend itself should there be aggressive military action on the part of China towards Taiwan. That also becomes critical when we think back to the production and availability of semiconductors until the United States is ready to be more self-sufficient on that front. Now, as we move from supply chain, trade, and tariffs over to energy, emissions, and the environment, we're also able to pull some facts and some quotes from Kamala Harris's campaign website. Specifically, a focus around cutting red tape on clean energy products to avoid a reliance on foreign oil. The quote that I pulled reads, "Since the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, companies have already announced more than $265 billion in clean energy investments, creating more than 330,000 new jobs. As a result of these investments, national battery storage capacity is projected to double in 2024. Solar module manufacturing capacity is going to be more than 5 times higher in 2024 than just 3 years earlier. And wind energy production will reach a record high in 2024. Now, most of that information, those numbers, that intention, is focused around clean energy. But there's also a statement in the campaign website that places an emphasis on the U.S. being a net energy exporter going forward. Traditionally, that makes you think fossil fuels, but in some of these areas, perhaps the evidence they've seen of scaled capacity and production capability makes them think that some of the clean energy can be captured and shipped abroad. Now, moving to emissions and the environment, first I pull from Kamala Harris's campaign website. The website describes the Inflation Reduction Act, on which I'll note she cast the tie-breaking vote to achieve passage, as the largest investment in climate action in history. This aligns very closely with her perspective on energy policy. The website says it is, quote, lowering household energy costs, creating hundreds of thousands of high-quality clean energy jobs, and building a thriving clean energy economy, all while ensuring America's energy security and independence with record energy production. Now, when we move from the campaign website over to the New Way Forward platform, we start to get some idea around how this clean energy policy might extend into manufacturing and production. For instance, producing, quote, clean iron and steel. I appreciated an acknowledgement pulled from the platform that in many cases, making progress towards clean energy, clean production requires a lot of regulatory oversight. And so the platform says, quote, push to increase the number of projects that qualify for the simplest form of environmental review so that agencies can expedite projects that will lower costs without harming the environment. So it's an interesting recognition that while, yes, there's generally regarded to be good reason to push towards clean energy, it's essential to make sure that businesses are still free to innovate at an appropriate pace if we want them to be competitive worldwide. Now, I expected to find a lot of emissions regulation notes on the website, in Kamala Harris's platform, but I did not. So it's hard for me to say if she would continue the plans of the Biden administration, especially thinking of supply chain, those that affect emissions reduction among Class 8 trucks and passenger vehicles, or if there would be some change to policy there. Now, 2 additional areas that I think are relevant, but might not necessarily rise to the level of being considered policy, are price fixing and corporate taxes. Kamala Harris's position on price fixing is very clear in the New Way Forward platform, and it contains a line that says, on top of this, she'll instruct her administration to focus on investigating and prosecuting price fixing, where companies illegally collude to set prices up and down food supply chains. Finally, she will make sure the federal government has the resources to identify and take on anti-competitive practices in the food and grocery industries. There are supporting notes that she plans to call on Congress to pass the first ever federal ban on price gouging, stating that when costs go up, prices must go up as well, but not excessively so that large companies are able to profit on the difference. Now, this is something that certainly everyone in corporate America is going to want to be aware of. Conceptually, it's easy to say, yes, price gouging is bad, but it's always the execution where the devil lingers in the details. And so, what will the new standards be for deciding when price gouging is taking place? Will there be an expectation that companies will prove they are not price gouging? You can be certain that if these regulations pass, procurement and supply chain professionals will be expected to step up and provide, hopefully, the defense, but if need be, a defense. The last piece that I want to share is corporate taxes. Yet another area where a president's platform definitely is going to affect our daily work based on the amount of working capital companies have available to them to invest in new projects. Based on the New Way Forward platform, Kamala Harris plans to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%, where it currently sits at 21% today. So those are the facts on Kamala Harris, her platform, a little bit of additional information there from the Democratic National Committee. If you have additions, corrections, or questions about any of this information or any of the sources that I referenced, please reach out. Tomorrow, we will continue this series with Part 3, examining former President Donald Trump's policies, platforms, and positions according to the same framework I used today.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, an event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.